Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Selina. Hi, Jack. Nice to meet you. And thank you for joining us to talk about your dissertation, which won the Food Geographies Research Group Dissertation Prize in 2020. My name is Helen Trail, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Glasgow in the Adam Smith Business School. But I'm here today in my capacity as one of the ECR reps on the Food Geographies Research Group committee. And I'm really excited to talk about your dissertation, actually. It's a really interesting piece of work you've done.
Yeah, I love reading as well. I'm Jack Pickering. I recently finished my PhD at Cardiff University, and I'm the conference officer for one of the conference officers for the RGS, Food Geographies Working Group. Okay.
Nice. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Would you want to introduce yourself a little bit? What you're doing at the moment and where you're working and?
Yeah. My name's Selina Treuherz. I wrote the dissertation. I've just finished my undergraduate degree at the University of Sheffield in human geography, and now I'm meant to be working as a chef, but I'm currently on furlough because of the lockdown.
Of course, yeah.
So we wondered if we could start, if you could just tell us the story of your dissertation. So where you got the inspiration for it and what spurred it on what spurred you on to study haute cuisine? And maybe actually you could tell us its title as well, because otherwise future listeners will not know what we're talking about.
Okay, so the title of the dissertation was 4 Seasons of Hegemony, an analysis of the embodied and discursive practices which facilitate gendered hegemonic encounters in elite restaurants. It was a very long title. And the inspiration for it was primarily, there was no way that my dissertation wouldn't be about food because I love cooking. And I had started working as a chef in my first year at the end of my first year of university, primarily because I desperately needed a job. And then when my dissertation tutor, Peter Jackson, found out where I was working, he thought that it would be a really exciting place to study. So that was the basis behind it. And I think it's quite an interesting place to study because there's not very much research from an academic perspective of what it's like working in a restaurant. It's often from an outsider's perspective. And so it's not a very well-known space, particularly in human geography. And the power dynamics are very poignant in these spaces. And that was one of the things that really struck me, as well as the fact that I was working in a very male-dominated environment, which was unlike any other working environment I'd ever been, where you're expected to work 70 hours a week. Given how much of an impact these kind of restaurants have on society, I just thought it would be a really interesting place to study.
Definitely, yeah. Sounds super interesting and super relevant. Yeah, like you say, there's a kind of connection there between that kind of food space and the rest of the society is really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about any work on food that inspired you?
When I saw this question, it's really hard for me to answer because there was so much that I wanted to say. I think the thing that I thought was first important to speak about was all the visceral geographers. So the ones that really inspired me when I was doing my degree were like the Hayes Conroy sisters, Rachel Longhurst, Elspeth Probyn, and all of the visceral geography literature that I read, both academically and personally, felt really important and inspiring for me because of the way that it interlinked all of the stuff about food in a very feminist lens. And those were the papers that I went back to and inspired most of the essays during my degree, because they were making that link between what was happening in the body and what we were eating and how it linked to society in quite a political way, which was really interesting for me. And then the other things that are kind of like, I suppose Peter and Megan, Professor Peter Jackson and Dr. Megan Blake were 2 lecturers that were really important for me at the University of Sheffield. Megan's work on food ladders, I've read quite a lot about, and also Peter, the way that I learned a lot about the cultural turn from him, and then, which was his earlier work, and then how he interlink that into stuff about food was really important and shaped quite a lot of my dissertation. And then like less academic food work, I read loads of chefs' work. I really like M.K. Fisher, who's a 1930s housewife, and all of her work is really beautiful, and like Nigella and Hugh Fearnley Whittingstall and Nigel Slater. And then more recently, the Vittles newsletter. I don't know if either of you have heard about it, but the way that it's integrating kind of decolonizing the food system and thinking about current restaurants and stuff, it's so exciting. And the conversations that it's making outside of mainstream media are really, really fantastic.
It's such a range of sources of inspiration there, and it's really nice to hear too that the teaching at Sheffield and the I guess the things that you were exposed to through your degree were so important in shaping where you ended up. And I think it's so interesting to hear how I guess maybe it's the Gramsci praxis thing coming through a bit, but the relationship between the chefing that you do and the way that you're also thinking about it in this quite theoretical and in-depth way is really nice to hear. One thing that I really enjoyed in your dissertation was that you were thinking a lot about the body in the restaurant and the way that the body was part of what was happening and maybe an understudied aspect of what goes on within a restaurant. Could you tell us a little bit about what it was like to research that as somebody who obviously was there as an academic researcher, but also a chef?
Yeah, well, as I said before, a lot of my essays were about the body before my dissertation. And I think a lot of them, it was the theme that like the body is so integral to how we outside our lived experience, but a lot of the time that's not fully recognized. And I thought it was just quite significant in a restaurant, even though I was trying not to focus it and give quite descriptive pieces in my research diary where I wrote my scratch notes. It's kind of the way that all the bodies in the kitchen have to work to these patterns and these rhythms, which is why the rhythm analysis stuff came in, where you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again, and the bodies are interweaving, but also at a kind of very visceral level, you're constantly tasting, you're getting cuts and burns, you're carrying these really heavy things, and you're really, really exhausted the whole time. So the body feels really, really important in a way that it may not do to the same extent in an office job. And so that seemed to come quite through while I was doing it. But in terms of the actual research process, it was a bit all over the place at times. I just had a notebook that I would write in during my breaks, but obviously I had to eat during my breaks as well, and I'd have a 20-minute break on my 9-hour shift. So sometimes I would like end up writing them in the evenings or like on the bus on the way to work. So it wasn't the most traditional way of like always doing it, yeah, at the end.
I was reminded actually when I was reading just snippets of your notes, and particularly in the dissertation where you talk about having to cram those notes into these spaces and moments where they're, you know, you're getting to put your feet up for like a very short period of time. It really reminded me of doing very long bar shifts. Actually, I thought that you captured that sense of snatched time away from the rest of the time where you're on your feet and you're on the go and you have all of these rhythms. I thought there was it took me back to being in a bar actually in quite an interesting way.
Yeah, you really communicated it in the way you wrote really well. It was really came through really strongly.
That's good. I think because I was reading rhythm analysis before I started, even though I was trying to do these descriptive notes, I think when I was doing my coding, I did it manually on these massive A3 sheets, which did actually kind of scare Peter because they were just so big and covered in scribbles. But like it was just kind of like there would always be the same thing over and over again because I'm making the same dishes every single day for the whole of that season. And it is that whole like rhythmic thing. It was really, yeah, it just had to happen really.
I think I produced a similar sort of like giant A3 mind map when I was planning my PhD actually. So yeah, I definitely have scared people with that kind of thing before. Definitely part of the process. So how did your colleagues feel about the research in the workplace? How did you feel about that as well? So, and how did you think your relationship with the material shaped what you found out?
I don't actually think the majority of chefs in the kitchen were that fussed. I would kind of say as a passing comment that I was doing this research after they'd signed it, their participant information sheets, and they didn't really care. They were too, because I was working during the summer and it's like the toughest season, you've got 80 covers twice a day. They were just fussed with doing their job, and this really didn't mean that much to them. But I think the head chef was particularly interested because there's only one other woman in the kitchen, and he wanted to hear what it would be like working as a woman. And I think he sees it as an issue within the kitchen that there is only one other woman. In terms of how material shaped what I was doing, I think it's a very personal space for me. I love being a chef, even though it's really, really hard. I love working there. And I knew that my head chef would be reading my dissertation at the end. So even though I wanted to be critical, I think I recognised that I had to be looking at the systemic issues within the hospitality industry, as opposed to just criticising this restaurant for being somewhat sexist in a way, but not like explicitly. So I suppose that, yeah, but being a chef and not an outsider was useful, because I don't think if I'd been coming into that space, it takes a long, long time. I'd already worked there for one summer for people to kind of like take you in and speak to you properly. And I was able to ask them questions like how it works when you're tasting stuff and the power dynamics around in that, in a way that I wouldn't have been able to if I was brand new.
Do you think it made it harder to write in a way? It was interesting because you were saying there that, you know, you didn't want to feel like you were criticizing this restaurant specifically too much, and you wanted to consider it in a structural way. Did that make the writing process harder, or do you think that it maybe pushed you to do a fairer job or a more thorough job, or talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, the gender aspect of the piece was actually the last bit that I kind of put in at the very, very end, which seemed to link it all together. But actually, for the majority of the time, I was focusing more on the Gramscian notions of hegemony and the power dynamics in the space, rather than looking specifically at gender, because I didn't want to make it about gender. I didn't want this just to be, I'm the only woman in the kitchen and this isn't right. So I think it may have made it harder because I kept on being reluctant to add that part in. But at the same time, I think it meant that I was more thorough when looking at power dynamics, and when I was doing my coding, to try and step back and look at it in a kind of non-critical way and just see it for what it was, rather than kind of getting really emotionally invested, if that makes sense.
I think it is. I mean, I think everybody probably has that thing of like, when you work closely with an organization, wanting to represent them in a way that is fair. I guess that's why I use the word fair. It's something that comes up for me when I write too, which is, you know, how are you critical without feeling like you're taking making criticisms that are, you know, that maybe an organization don't have control over all of the aspects within. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It definitely does. And I think the other thing that I had to take account of is that I'm a commie chef, and I'm in the staff diagram, I am literally at the very, very bottom of the pile because I'm still in my training. So there are a lot of people with a lot more authority than me. And given that I knew I wanted to continue working there after I finished my degree, I couldn't be really overtly critical of this space, because I didn't want to be, I didn't need to be, but that I couldn't be, because I wanted to be a chef and I knew that this was this place where I wanted to work afterwards.
You're sort of within the hierarchy already, so that you're sort of discussing, yeah, sort of realities of being in that hierarchy. Yeah, I've got to say, I should say as well, I think I learned so much reading through the dissertation. It was so there were so many terms and things I just never come across before. Sort of the background things you don't even sort of hear about on sort of chef programs on TV. It's, yeah, really, really fascinating.
About the kitchen specifically, like the mise en place and stuff like that.
Yeah,
there is a whole language. It's really weird.
So as part of a conference actually a few years back with the RGS Food Geography Research Group, we visited Foodle in Sheffield. And I believe you volunteered there in the past. And one thing we were interested to ask you actually was what link you saw, between your work there and your work on more elite food spaces, and how you think they connect, and how you see that relationship within, I guess, the broader food scene.
Well, I actually cooked for that event at Foodle. I got paid to do it. It was one of my summer jobs. So I was there. I also volunteered for the event through Sheffield Geography. So I went to quite a few talks at it, which were really interesting. So just for a bit of an explanation, Foodle is a community kitchen in Sheffield, and it works on a contribute what you can basis. So anybody in the community can come and get a hot meal, and they contribute through the means that they can, be that in a monetary way or by doing the washing up or something like that. And I know that I shouldn't, but I want to plug their National Food Service, which is another organisation that I work for, which Foodle was the founding branch of. And there are 8 spaces like Foodle across the country, and we're all united by the aims to tackle food insecurity, social isolation, social inequality, and food waste. So we're basically using surplus food to feed the community and increase community resilience. And the 2 spaces, the elite restaurant and Foodle, are in very many ways opposite ends of the food system. One is kind of based on sort of anarchist values of mutual aid, and the other is making millions of pounds in profit every single year. So they are very, very different. But I think the thing that unites them, and the reason that I feel comfortable working in both spaces, is because they are centered around the idea of commensality, which is the act of eating together. And I think both of them, be it for a millionaire or somebody who's just come into the elite restaurant for their wedding day and has saved up for years, or all of us eating around the big table at Foodle, it's all about creating memories and bringing people together through food, which is a really, really important thing for me. And in a similar way, both spaces, in a different way, with different aims, are trying to create a better food system. The most explicit way that they're similar is that they're both trying to reduce food waste. So at Foodle, we're using surplus food to feed people. And at the elite restaurant, you can't waste anything because you're throwing hundreds of pounds of profit down the drain. And then at the restaurant, we're working with the seasons, and we're using as good a quality produce as possible. And it's trying to put good food in people's bellies. But at Foodle, it's far less explicit than that. And it's like people haven't eaten at all, and we're giving them their one meal. But I suppose at the National Food Service, it is trying to hold the government to account and make sure that they realise how severe of an issue food insecurity is at the moment, or local authorities, and making sure that everybody has access to a hot meal. Another way that I thought that there was a similarity, which isn't as positive, is my experience as a woman. So the reason that I was in Sheffield in the summer of 2019 was because I was doing some research with Dr. Megan Blake about the geographies of care in the public sphere at Foodle. So I was working there quite a lot and speaking to a lot of community members. And there were times when, being a woman, I felt quite stigmatized, and they would say hurtful comments. And it was a similar male-dominated environment when I went to do my research 2 weeks later at the restaurant, where I was the only woman in the space. And I think that there's a real irony to this, that, there's a whole idea that women are meant to be in the kitchen, but in these 2 spaces where I was feeding hundreds of people, I didn't feel like I belonged there. And that's something that has felt really important for me and really shaped me and has led to where I'm being.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it really is. So how do you understand the kind of connections between the high-end kind of luxury food space that you worked in and kind of everyday food culture more? Because this kind of came through in your dissertation a little bit, but I just wondered if you could talk about it a little bit more.
Well, as you said, you learnt quite a few terms from the dissertation. So I feel like there's an assumption that it's a really abstract place that not many people know about. And especially when you know that a meal there costs £200, which is like half of my monthly rent, it feels really, really far away from what we eat every day. But I think for me, it feels more relevant than we give it credit in so many ways, just because like there are chefs like Jamie Oliver and Heston Blumenthal who have shaped so much of what we eat now and what we come to know. And that obviously has impacts on what we buy in the supermarkets, and has set loads and loads of food trends. As someone that keeps up to date with that, you notice how much chefs are having a say on it. And especially during lockdown, when restaurants were shut, we were aware of how much we missed them, and people came far more excited about cooking and food, and it's become a really, really important part of people's days. So I think that's the biggest similarity that I can think of.
Yes, it's kind of a thing that's sort of mediated through some kind of celebrities and figures in a way. Yeah.
I do wonder whether there's something in, I don't know, just the contrast almost that you were making between this idea of kitchens as this supposedly feminized space and and then these very male-dominated spaces that you were working in, though. I don't know where I'm going with that, except that I do think it's interesting that in that translation, it's almost like, particularly if we're talking about Hester Blumenthal or Jamie Oliver, we are talking about famous men who are translating this kind of high culture into our maybe feminized home kitchens. But that's probably a bit of an oversimplified gender dynamic. It was just really interesting to hear you talking about yourself within those spaces. What did you find the most interesting thing, the most interesting finding from your research? And was there anything that you really wanted to take further that you maybe didn't have space for within the dissertation?
Well, I feel like it goes back to what you were speaking about before. I don't know if it's the most interesting thing that I found, but the thing that really has impacted me is recognizing the relationship between the social and historical foundations of gastronomy, where it was men in the army who became chefs, and that distancing from motherly notions of care and nourishment where women were in the home, and recognizing that distinction, and how as a result of that there is a kind of lack of care for ourselves as chefs while we're cooking, and we're burning ourselves and we're meant to be really macho. And that's the kind of thing that I think that was the most interesting finding that I found. And I think it is starting to be recognised in the restaurant industry that we need to take better care of ourselves, and that these hours are unsustainable and not healthy. You know, we've got reductions in the amount of days that restaurants are open, and people are actually following the legal requirements now, which is really good. But I suppose I feel like until we need to the thing I was trying to do with my dissertation is recognise the hegemonic nature of it, and how all of this is really, really entrenched. And it's not just these men being sexist, explicitly sexist to me, but actually like the practices that we're doing in these restaurants are masculinist, and that's what's having the impact. The way that I'd like to take it further is, because of my work with the National Food Service, I've obviously been looking at two very different ends of the food system. And I think in 2020, I think 1 in 20 families used a food bank. That may be wrong, but that was with the Trussell Trust, and only half of food banks are with the Trussell Trust. So a lot of people are really food insecure at the moment. And at the National Food Service, we've been working with some academics at the University of Salford who are kind of recognising how the infrastructure that the government's putting in place through food banks is now becoming a permanent part of our foodscape. And that's really terrifying, because it's going to remove them of responsibility in the future. But at the same time, 70% of restaurants think they're going to shut. So we've got these two really precarious spaces in the foodscape, which are really significant. And I don't think people are recognising how much food banks are actually part of the hospitality industry. We need to recognise these social eating spaces as part of it. And I kind of think that this is an opportunity. I don't know if this is actual research, but I think we can see this as an opportunity. We're getting all of these closed down restaurants and really insecure people. So whether it's through the National Food Service or not, the thing I've been thinking about loads is how we can make use of these spaces to make sure that everyone's got a hot meal.
I suppose it's building those connections between, you know, this supposedly abstracted haute cuisine space and I guess the way that I guess more ordinary food spaces. There is actually, when you were talking there, I was wondering if you maybe haven't, because it's quite a specific Glasgow thing that the Glasgow Community Food Network organise, but they do a chef's challenge every year where they connect up kind of local chefs and locally grown produce from their community gardens, and they do a kind of a competition, and it's just quite an interesting and quite a nice way, I guess, of connecting up these often quite separate food spaces.
I think that's a link that really needs to be made. I saw that Peter Jackson was talking to chefs at a thing about a talk for the UN about how to be more sustainable, but I think we need to start making that link. We're chefs because we love cooking and we love feeding people, and so it's just so ironic that there are so many people going hungry, and that's what our skill is, especially when we're all on furlough.
Yeah. It's an opportunity perhaps as well as a crisis.
Yeah, it's like really fertile ground to be working in and sort of experimenting with at the moment.
I hope so. I hope that it happens.
Yeah. So what do you think the restaurant industry specifically could learn from your work?
That feels like a really big question. I think recognising the importance of care and how we need to look after ourselves and think about mental health more. And also just kind of put our hands up and be like, there is actually an issue that the restaurant industry doesn't have enough women in it, given that women have primarily been in the kitchen, or that there aren't enough like people of colour in these haute cuisine spaces, and kind of making more inclusive environment by recognising the practices that we're doing and how they contribute to stuff. Yeah, I hope my head chef has been quite keen to learn from it, and it's really exciting that we might be able to implement these kind of practices at the restaurant, and hopefully that can have repercussions in other spaces in the food industry.
I like the idea of them taking on the idea of care, and I do hope that they can learn from it, and it's nice to hear that they're really open to your research as well. That's really nice to hear of that kind of level of reflexivity in reaction to your work. And maybe there's scope for quite a broad idea of care within that. Maybe we can care for each other within the space of a restaurant, but we can also care for the broader communities in which they sit. And maybe we can connect these things up in an interesting way. It's been so interesting to talk to you, Selina. I feel like you have so many things to say about food. What are your plans for the future? Tell us, where will we find you next?
Probably in a kitchen. I think I'm going to continue training to be a chef for a bit, and go around all of the sections of the kitchen. But this award has maybe shown to me that I should go back to academia in some capacity at some point, because I do really enjoy speaking about food in an academic sense. But I'm not sure. I'm going to carry on doing lots of work for the National Food Service as well.
That sounds great and really important.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.